So the bridge that we use to cross the theory, or the divide between theory or ideas or suggestions or methods to the actualization of that, and we call that theory and application. But there's a lot of different words that you could use instead of theory and application. But the idea is that there needs to be a mechanism. And so there's two mechanisms, and it's yin and yang, acute and, I guess chronic's not the best word, but small, big, more of a acute situation, more of a broad situation. So the the thing, or the component that helps a person to cross the divide between theory and application is a technique. And it sounds to me like you were applying one technique or another. And any technique that you're doing, I can put into the 4 directions. I don't know if you've ever reverse engineered it, but if somebody comes and they're like, I have this technique, and I'm like, that's cool, I could easily categorize that within one of my 4 directions, because it's going to be one of the 4. It's pretty comprehensive in that way. So that's kind of an acute way of looking at it. That's a smaller way of looking at the idea of a mechanism to help me cross the divide between theory and application. But then there's the more elongated, broad way to look at that, and that is the learn, grow, and evolve way of looking at it. I think one way that we could talk about it is the way that Don Juan would talk about the universe. He would use the term forces, and that could be a confusing word in English, when we think about forces, but really it has to do with momentum. The force is a result of accumulation of momentum of some sort. You could say that a car can generate force because of momentum. A fist can generate force because of momentum. But so can your habits, so can your thoughts, so can the collective environment. So could collective environment in terms of the entire human species has a momentum to it, and we could say that that is a force. And so in Don Juan's mind, the entire universe is just a series of momentous forces. He didn't use the word momentum. I'm just using that to help, you know, bring that concept to a way that we can work with it a little bit. But the idea is learn, grow, and evolve. Well, what's the mechanism for learning? That's the same thing that crosses the divide between theory and application. That's technique. So the technique helps us to be more present so that we can learn. But the grow and the evolve is when we get into situations that we've been in before. If we were practicing the 4 directions, the force going into that situation is going to be different. So Ida, we could say that the force of Ida, like the accumulated momentum of your being, of your life. You know how people say, like, every choice I've made, everything has brought me to this point right now. They say that like when weird or things that seem like synchronicities, or they say it then, but that's actually everything. Like every single point of your life, everything has brought you to that point. That's a force, right? The momentum of your life experience, you could look at it as a type of force. Well, how do you interact with that force? It sounds like something in the cognitive direction of attention. How are we interacting with the forces of our own lives? So in an acute way of looking at it, the practice is a technique that helps us to cross the divide between theory and application. A more broad way of looking at it is the practice helps us to learn, grow, and evolve, so that when we end up in situations that you can't prep for, you can't specifically necessarily plan for, right? So in martial arts, you learn how to defend yourself, but you don't necessarily learn a very specific scenario, like the second you walk off the train or something like that, and you're going down the stairs and all of a sudden someone's there. Like, you didn't train for that specifically, but the techniques that you've been doing will help you to adapt in that unique situation that you're in, because of the learn, grow, and evolve with self-awareness principle. So it sounds to me that you were exercising both, Ida. You were exercising and I think you might not be surprised. I think general people who start to practice this, when you get into a situation that requires adaptation, I go immediately to the warrior considerations and the four directions immediately. So if I'm in any situation where I'm like, oh, like I didn't specifically plan for this, I didn't specifically plan for, ICE and a Gestapo type of scenario to drop in Chicago. I didn't plan for that, right? So what do I do? Well, I go back to my four directions practice and I learn and I grow and I evolve with self-awareness so that when I repeat and I'm in a similar situation, I'll be able to adapt more elegantly. So with the back pain or with any pain that we experience, it's a similar thing, or situations of how do we deal with pain? How do we deal with illness? How do we deal with loss? How do we deal with insanity in the world around us? And deal, I think the best word that we could use for deal is how do we adapt? How do we maintain relative harmony in the midst of the exterior environment not being all too harmonious? Self-awareness and the momentum of adaptivity grows in degrees over time, assuming that the practice is maintained and assuming that we're not leaking power. Because there's two primary things, because we're talking about forces of momentum. And one of the worst things we could do in this practice is to relinquish or interfere with our own momentum. But that's absolutely correct. If we're doing our practice, if we stick to it little bit by little bit, then that will accumulate over time. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at leaking power. We talked about it in a certain context for the conversation at the time, leaking power as getting down on yourself. But there's other ways. Um, I have separated it terminology wise so that we don't get confused. But leaking power is getting down on yourself, getting down on others, telling yourself you can't do something or you shouldn't be or you should be. That's one that people may not be looking as leaking. No, it is. First of all, you have an unnecessary focus on yourself. You're thinking about yourself. And so I use two different terms now. So leaking power is very specific, how we were using the word. I don't want to change that. That's good. And another phrase that we have been using for a very long time, but it's kind of the same thing, but it's more elongated, right? Leaking power, we could look at that as acute. You are leaking power in this moment. But there is another way of looking at it where you are injuring your spirit. And Don Juan would talk about this a lot. Don Juan would run up a hill at however old he was, and he would do it faster, quicker, more efficiently, using less energy than everybody else around him. And of course, that begs the question, and Carlos asked it. He's like, how are you doing this? And again, whether this story is true or untrue or imaginative or, documentative, whether they're documenting live events, real events, or they're just making it up, the answer still has juice. Like it still matters. And the answer, Don Juan said, is, well, it's not what I do, it's what I don't do. It's what I'm not doing. And I know we can't not do something, but this is just a way of talking about things. He's just trying to explain a concept that I don't injure my spirit. I don't do things that cause me to, and this is how it relates to leaking power. I don't do things that interfere with the accumulative factor. And a habit that has started to accumulate over time that maybe we're not aware of as much. It sneaks in and it's starting to gain some momentum. If that continues, it will be injurious to the spirit. And there's one easy way to define this. Existing in an extreme injures the spirit. It's a principle. Buddha, I don't think it was Buddha who said this. I think this is just, how people are. They have a saying and they attribute it to who they think is the most appropriate for that saying. But attachment isn't the source of suffering because the source of attachment is existing in an extreme. You have allowed yourself to indulge an extreme point, and that indulgence leads to attachment. And then the attachment, depending on the severity, when the object or item or situation or whatever of attachment is removed, well, then that's when all the suffering comes. You feel the suffering when the aspect or item of attachment is removed. So somebody says, well, how do I know I'm attached to my coffee cup? Well, what would happen if I broke it? What would happen if I stole it? What would happen if you couldn't find it? How much suffering would that cause you? Or, as Ida was pointing out, would we have an acute technique, which is go back to our four directions, maybe some rapid redirection, maybe some talking to ourselves in a productive way, maybe reminding ourselves of the warrior principles and taking into consideration where my mind should be in this particular situation. And then the accumulated momentum of that, well, if I'm not very consistent with my practice and I'm just doing it, blah, and it's just like every now and then, I'm checking into my four directions. Oh no, when something like Edith was describing happens, oh, you're going to be thrown way off. You're probably going to be leaking power and injuring your spirit all at the same time. And these are just ways of describing things, categories, of course, because if we got down to it, leaking power is injuring the spirit. Injuring the spirit is leaking. I'm just, creating categories so that we can more functionally discuss it in a life application type of thing. So I think the pain is, I have had, especially working, or not working, but yeah, working in a clinic, treating people, learning so much about the human body, there is this tendency for students and uh, basically it's like a hypochondriac type of situation where you're like, you hear something and now you're checking yourself for it. And you're like, oh my God, I had a pain in my lower abdomen. Is this an aortic embolism? Like what is going on? Like, and it's like, no, you just learned that concept a couple weeks ago, and now you're mirroring it in your body, and that's it. You got to be careful with that. The mind is very strong, and so when I notice myself doing that, I'm like, oh no, four directions. Like, where was I just now? I'm going to go back to my practice, and then when I find myself doing that, it's easier to redirect because of the accumulative principle that we were talking about. But
Yes, and I
also, yeah,
find I'm looking for solutions all the time. In my husband's health, I'm looking for solutions. I'm going, maybe it's because this or because that. And that's an awful, it's not a nice energy, and I can spot it straight away when I'm trying to find a solution. That's one of the things that we talked about. We used to have a list of expectations, solutions,
these were, yeah,
um,
yeah,
time.
mhm,
Time was one.
the
Yeah,
destroyers.
so yeah, destroyers. Solutions is a big one for me because I like to fix things.
Well, I would caution you to not maybe enter the medical field because that is one of the biggest trap that students have. This idea that I need to fix, I need to find a solution, I need to correct, I need to cure or heal this person. And that's a rabbit hole. That's a very deep rabbit hole that a person can go down. And I think it inhibits their ability to, especially when we're talking about, acupuncture, Chinese medicine, holistic medicines, it's very intention driven, right? The intention of the practitioner is extremely vital. It's hugely important. And if the practitioner is like thinking about how to fix you, and but that's
Except
so yeah, go
except
ahead.
in an acute setting. There's a fine line between that because your mind can make a non-acute issue into an acute issue. But trying to talk yourself out of it and wait, I was listening to Ida's story, and one part of my warrior brain is looking at it like, um, from the direction that you explained. And the other part of my nursing brain is looking at it like it could have been an acute situation, and waiting 40 minutes could have been a deadly decision. So, in the ER or in nursing, in medicine in general, you go to the worst possible scenario and rule that out and then work your way down because you want to treat the most acute thing as quickly as possible because that saves lives. And the sooner you intervene in an acute appendicitis or an aortic aneurysm or a stroke or a heart attack and things like that, it makes an enormous difference in the quality of life of the person if you can intervene intervention early. Within minutes, things can change. But how do you discern whether you are the thing is worsening, the symptom is worsening because of your panic over it, or whether the symptom is worsening because you're in an acute situation? And just like you said, when you get to the bottom of the stairs and you see a guy standing there, or I couldn't prepare for ice showing up, you can't really prepare for those circumstances other than just doing your practice, because then your self-awareness and your ability to discern becomes more acute and more precise. And you can go, I feel my heart racing over the prospect of this being an acute thing, but the pain really isn't that severe. Or you can say, wow, this is a pain that is all consuming, and I've never had anything like that before, and it's best to go get that checked out. And what's the worst that could happen? I'll sit in an ER for a little while. So, and those decisions come from practice, and learning this practice through you and with you guys has reminded me so much of the art of medicine and the art of nursing, is that I had to help make those nursing diagnosis decisions by calming myself and staying in my practice of presence, allowed me to be better at not freaking out over a patient's report for what happened to them. So yeah, I don't, it's a slippery slope sometimes. You have to really know, you have to have an acute sense of self-awareness. Well, the more self-awareness you have, the better you're able to make those decisions or adapt and make decisions accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what we're really talking about is when when Ida described it, the word was trying. And we've used that word a lot. And, we don't have to get into Yoda, because that can be confusing the way that Yoda says it. It's not very clear. Do or do not, there is no try. It's like, well, no, I don't understand. Like, an attempt is a try. But we're not talking about semantics. We're talking about the difference between like elegant inflow adaptation as a result of training and knowledge and, the momentum of that, the momentum of all of your training, the momentum of all of your knowledge arriving at this point, that's the force that we were talking about, that force that's behind your ability to adapt to a emergency situation elegantly, as opposed to what would likely happen if it's not elegant. Okay, so we have an elegant adaptation to an emergency situation because of training. Maybe they weren't trained. Maybe they're just really good at their four directions practice and they were able to go to it and do the best that they could, right? What's the difference between that and a non-elegant, fluid adaptation response? What's usually going to be the thing that disrupts the flow of an elegant adaptive response?
Fear.
Fear is a big one. So fear is going to drive it. You can't have courage
Think of
without
everything
fear.
as fear. I think of anger as fear. I think of any type of control or manipulation as fear. I think of all of it as fear. So
Right. I don't
that's
disagree.
always
I
my
think that,
first response. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
Your
Yeah, I
thoughts?
think,
What's your thoughts about the,
okay.
imaginary scenarios in your head about the worst case
There you go.
possibility?
There you go. Okay, so now we're cooking with something. Okay, because fear, I really just I can't agree with that, because fear is an appropriate response sometimes for the human being to communicate that there is a significant or a real danger, right? So we can't say that fear is bad. And I know you weren't saying that, but I'm just going to clarify that. But so yeah, fear is usually the impetus of most of these things. Like, why are we existing in an extreme? Well, that's going to even maybe be traced back to a fear. So I don't disagree with that at all. But how does that fear manifest itself? Because fear can manifest itself as courage, right? You
Sure.
can't have courage without fear.
Yeah, it's fear can be the propulsion for things, but
Right.
people call me for advice all of the time because I'm a nurse, and they trust me. So they go, I have this, what do you think I should do? And I said, it sounds, I ask a bunch of questions and I said, it sounds to me like the probability is it could be this or that, which isn't an acute thing, but it could be an acute thing. I could be wrong. I don't live inside your body, and I have no medical tests based on just this is just information you're giving me. So I would say go to the ER because then you won't be worried about it anymore. Then you'll know for sure what it is, and you won't spend your time second guessing and then going down the rabbit hole of like and Ida illustrated all that. Should I walk? Shouldn't I walk? Maybe I should rest today. Maybe I'll aggravate it. Maybe I'll, all of that stuff. No, I'm just going to go do what I'm going to do. And when something comes up, I'll address it at that time.
Mhm.
And so, the first initial talk comes from a medical perspective, but then secondarily is whatever their capacity is, some people just worry and panic.
Sure.
And they can go on for that, and knowing them, they can go on with that for weeks. So why
Mhm.
don't you just go to the doctor and get a strep test, or why don't you go get checked, and then you can calm your mind, and then you'll be able to approach this from a more rational standpoint or,
Sure.
more elegant standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And then but the underlining mechanisms, right? Because Ida was spot on. Her answer was absolutely 100% unequivocally correct because we have stimuli. And as a result of the stimuli, the subject exhibits fear. No, 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 they're not out of balance yet. I'm not going to say that that's not harmonious. I don't know. How many times have they been in front of a tiger or a lion or a building that's on fire? So maybe their fear response is a part of that force of the accumulation of their life experience. And, they're experiencing it acutely. So the fear itself could lead to an inspired, adaptive, flow type of response where there's a lot of courage, there's a lot of get shit done energy, there's not a lot of interference. So in that scenario, everything up to that point was the same. So and now we have a different scenario where we have the stimuli and then we have the fear, but the fear is a force that the person hasn't really been addressing because maybe maybe they don't have a practice, right? Maybe they're not used to emotionally checking themselves on a daily basis to see where they are and where they're going and how am I sounding to myself and to others. So the idea though is that we have the stimuli, we have the fear response. All that's actually still okay. That still could all be perfectly appropriate. It could be, we could dissect it and we could find examples where the fear response actually isn't appropriate because there's nothing in the immediate environment that is worthy or should be causing that fear response. And then it's usually a psychological thing. But and in that example, we typically don't have that stimuli, that impetus stimuli that we have to respond to quickly. So, but the idea is we have the stimuli elicited fear. That's okay. That scenario could be 100% okay. Then again, maybe not. It just depends. But in this example, it is okay, right? Maybe they saw somebody get mugged or something, and they see that. Well, they've never seen that before. They've never been in that situation. They don't know exactly what to do. Okay, that's the scenario. We had the stimuli. The person is being ambushed. They're being mugged, and then we have the fear for the person, the fear for their own life, the fear that came out of nowhere. That's a force that just they're expressing. And that could be 110%. I'm sorry, there's no such thing. That's 100% appropriate. They could be. But what do we do? Like, what is next? Like, what's the next component of that? Do we start to interfere with ourselves through the form of thought, through the form of another emotion from fear that is a part of a larger pattern for that person? Like maybe they go from fear to hiding, like they feel the need to shy away and hide and duck and cover as an emergency mechanism that they learned a long time ago when they were younger. That's how they respond to that type of situation, right? That could be an example. Or an example of a person who their mind is just so rapid and they don't know what to do and they're just all over the place and that leads to panic. And it's because of the way that they processed the fear and the stimuli. One person maybe is practicing this practice. And even though they've never been in this situation, they were practicing right before it. And maybe they start to think weird thoughts and they're like, well, no, wait, that's not helping. Let me ask this person some questions. Let me try to get to the bottom of this. I guess if they're getting mugged, we're not asking them questions, but I just switched from one scenario to a different one in my own mind. But you get the idea. So Ida was right. So typically in a situation, so we feel pain in our own body, or somebody else is injured or hurt. And what is our process? Do we go to the four directions? Do we go to our breath? Do we tell ourselves something that we need to? You got this. You can do this. Just help them, just do something. Just do something. Anything would be better than nothing in this situation. Whatever you have to tell yourself, but that's productive self-dialogue. It's a part of the redirection technique. You're redirecting back to a place where you can operate more within the situation that's occurring in a harmonious way, in a way that will be beneficial to everybody. But Ida gave a perfect example of when that doesn't occur. Usually thoughts are going to get in the way. Habits are going to get in the way. We're going to start looking back on things. We're going to start telling ourselves things. But there's probably going to be a lot of words. And so usually when someone uses the word trying the way that Ida did earlier, it implies that there was a lot of potentially leaking power processes that injure the spirit, trying to find solutions. And we've talked about this. We've talked about this since day one. Solutions arrive. You meet the solution in the ether. The solution comes through you, but it can't come through you if it's tense, if it's tight, if it's trying to figure something out. The thing that you're trying to figure out can't arrive to you. Where does the solution come from? Where does the solution come from? If you have a solution somewhere in your body, in your brain, in your nervous system, so if you have a solution, where did it come from? And let's say that the solution can, yeah,
It comes from the
it
space.
could come from
When
your
you're,
training. It could come from
yeah,
intuition.
intuition, and that is only available when you have the space.
Right. And your practice will create the availability. So
Yeah.
in all situations, it's where is my mind? Where is my four directions? It doesn't have to be where is your four directions. If you're a guru and you're just really good at all this stuff anyway, then you just do whatever you're doing. I don't care. But for me, if I'm in a situation that I'm maybe not completely familiar with, or not familiar with at all, or am super familiar with, actually, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go back to my four directions practice. If I'm familiar with the situation, then I'm really going to put my intention on that familiarity. I'm gonna put my four directions into what is familiar. If I'm unfamiliar with something, I'm gonna put my four directions practice into what is unfamiliar. If it's so unfamiliar that it throws me out of my practice and I don't respond as elegantly as I would like to, I go back to my four directions practice, because how am I going to learn? How am I going to grow? How am I going to evolve if I'm in a panic state the entire time? I'll create state memory. And in that case, I might have to have a therapy session to be able to recall what even occurred, because my mind shuts it out. It's a part of a defense mechanism. My mind is trying to keep me safe, and that memory that causes a biological response that the body identifies with very unsafe. And it was actually very hard for me, Donna, to also not go into that medical mindset where I was like, okay, well, did we do any active and passive resistance? Because if you use active resistance, and active resistance re-elicits pain, that's probably not organ pain. Movement can cause organ pain if you're already having it. Like if you're having an appendicitis, there's a reason that people go into this fetal position. It's because that feels better. Even marginally, it feels better. And they just do it naturally. Like if somebody's choking, you'll never see somebody choking like, no, they grab their throat. There's no secret. There's no hiding, because that's just their reaction. That's the acute reaction coming from, it's not even coming from the brain. That reaction very likely coming from the spine and the nerves in there, in the that's still the central nervous system, but it's like a reflex reaction to do this. And that's how you know that a person is really choking and not just trying to prank you, because you can't hide that. So there's sometimes where Shayna's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Well, considering what we're talking about, if I wasn't okay, you would know. Like there would be, my face would be turning blue. I would be gagging and kicking, and, you know, there would be clear signs that Ernest is unwell." So I think the idea that the main underlying idea is still just, where is our practice? Where has our practice been? How do we adapt when we're having a situation that we're unfamiliar with? Or, of course, the situations that are going to have the most momentum are the ones where there's the most attachment. And our attachment to our own lives is something that we can't escape. I'm attached to existence, and it causes me suffering sometimes to think about non-existence. Hey, that's something that I have to work out. That's my garden to tend to, no one else's. I'm just being honest about it. You know, I really enjoy existence. And the great thing about this practice is it's all principle based. So you actually don't even have to think about solutions. You don't even have to think about any of the stuff we're talking about right now. You just have to do your practice, and it will work out, because the principle of the universe dictates that it will. So here's a fond thought, and maybe it's something that we could talk more about, especially after I'm graduated and licensed. But in chapter 8 of the Su Wen, which is one of the oldest medical textbooks, and it's not a textbook, but medical writings uh, in the world. Su Wen, Huande Neijing, these are the oldest manuscripts of written words on health and wellness. Well, not wellness, but medicine. Wellness is a newly emerging word, which is cool. It's a fun word. But in this book, in chapter 8, it says that all disease originates with Shen, spirit, emotion. All disease. If Shen, spirit, and emotion are strong, a person cannot get sick. They'll still get old, you know, and they'll still pass away in their sleep effortlessly someday. They won't live to 1,000 years. There's no immortality. That violates principle. So we're not talking about any of that crap. But what we are talking about is, principally, if emotion and spirit can be a cause of pathology, emotion and spirit can be a way to rebalance, prevent, and address pathology. And that's what this practice ultimately will help a person do. The way that that looks is, the more that a person does their 4 directions acutely, the more it will affect the elongated momentum of their life. So the more consistent, the more momentum and energy that is behind their everyday practice, the more they're going to, and especially if a person was to do it the way that I describe it, I'm sure there's other ways to get to this practice, or this way of looking at it. Again, I'm probably not unique in putting things together, but one of the things that I focus on personally is creating the bubble of perception. The bubble of perception is a result of 4 strong directions of attention. So if Ida's like, "I've been trying really hard to create my bubble of perception," I would say, don't do that. Stop trying. It's not a try thing. And I'm not saying you would, Ida. It's just, you were helping this conversation along, so I tend to go back to you. The bubble of perception exists whether you like it or not. Donna is creating a bubble of perception. If she's lost in thoughts and worries and woe is me, and, well, that bubble of perception is very tiny inside of her brain. And the exterior portion of the bubble of perception is, below the threshold of recognition. It is unconscious, which is always a part of our bubble of perception. So that's okay too. No worries. We can adapt. We can work with the conscious and unconscious aspects, because there's both happening simultaneously all the time. We can't escape one if we have the other. We can't have the other without the one. They they transform, they depend on one another to exist. So the idea is that the four directions will create a bubble of perception that is filled with awareness, that's filled with attention, and it gives a person the opportunity to fill it. So I'm sure you see where I'm going with this, but just to check in, does that make sense? So the four directions will create a bubble of perception that's full of awareness. And depending on how you do it, it could be full of personal power. It could be full of spirit energy. Just depends. And spirit energy, I'm just being very general because personal power is it's a force of momentum. The exact same thing that we've been talking about. Earth around the sun is a force of momentum. A fist going through the air is a force of momentum. A thought is a force of momentum. The impetus of an idea, the impetus of an action is a force of momentum. So what I have learned to do, and we'll see, because I have some physical abnormalities to contend with, but I'm operating on the hypothesis or theory that if I fill my bubble of perception with awareness, with love and kindness and compassion, with these emotions, and we could use the word emotion, but we're feeling it, right? If we're feeling it, it has a chemical component. I don't care what you think it is. It has a chemical component if you perceive it. The perception of it is the chemical component. What you're perceiving may not be chemical at all. It could be very energy related. So Donna walks into the room and she feels the energy. Okay, the energy that came in, well, that's not necessarily emotion, right? That's energy. That's a force that we've been talking about. But if she feels it, the feeling of it is an interpretation. The feeling of it is a chemical experience. And that's okay. It's chemical, it's spiritual, it's physical, it's non-physical. Of course, it's all of those things. People say that you're not a human being, you're a spirit. No, I'm both. Like, stop trying to say I am one or the other. I am this and I'm that. I'm plus and I'm minus. And when you put those things together, you get the bubble of perception. You get a new third thing. And so I spend my days not trying to figure it out, not trying to find out how I'm going to fix myself. I fill my bubble of perception with what I want it to be. And as long as I do that, even if I don't fix myself, if I have a heart attack right now, I did it filling my bubble of perception to the best of my ability. And that is what we call impeccability, doing your best. Well, it's doing your best, but it's an energy thing. It's not what you think your best is. Because if you're thinking about your best, you're just thinking about it again. That's just a concept. It's just an idea. It's a different kind of force than the actual force of you doing it.
So you receive the information by means of energy or pain or whatever. You receive this data and then you perceive it with your mind, and that's a different thing.
That's a different thing, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how we have
There's
so many different,
there's overlap.
there's overlap, but that's why we have so many different religions, is because we're all trying to individually describe perhaps the same thing.
Interpret very
Interpret it.
much the same
We're
thing.
just trying to interpret it. That's all we're ever doing, is we're just trying to interpret. That's called principle of the hawk. We can't escape that. It's a principle. You are creating the interpretation of your environment based on your brain's capability to do so, your body's capability to do so, and your spirit's capability to do so within the context of your body. So if we were to talk about a more accumulated practice, well, where is your four directions? I'm doing it. Sometimes I forget, but for the most part, I'm doing one of my four directions at all times, sometimes more than one, right? Okay, what does that do? Well, that makes me more aware. It makes me more alive. It makes me easier to adapt. And ultimately, it charges the bubble of perception. Okay, now what do you do in that bubble of perception? Well, now that's the thing. I don't know what you want to do. I do very certain things. And maybe Don Juan gave me the idea. I don't know. I don't know how that works exactly. But I know that if I fill my bubble of perception with my awareness, I start to see it. I start to see it in a different way. So when Shayna's walking down the street and she points out that there's nobody there, the trees have changed colors, the light is hitting in just the right way, the breeze and everything, it's all just creating a feeling that is filling your bubble of perception. Okay, yeah, that's all your interpretation of the energy forces around you, but you're seeing it. And what do I mean by seeing? Feeling it with your eyes, feeling it with your energy. That's just one thing you could do in the bubble of perception once you've established it. And of course, again, it's always there, but we're talking about establishing a bubble of perception that is purposeful. This should sound a lot like law of attraction because we're talking about the exact same thing. What am I doing in my bubble of perception? Exactly what the fuck I want to. Becoming a doctor, becoming a medical professional. I live the way that I want to live. There's some things I want to work on, but I look at the accumulative principle and I know I don't need to try to figure it out. I don't need solutions on how I'm going to get down to just one bag of garbage a month. I know that that's my goal. And I can't help but notice that the more that I do my practice, the more that I establish my bubble of perception, I meet my goals. And they're not always easy. Sometimes I have to more acutely redirect. Sometimes I have to more acutely adapt. And I know that sometimes things just aren't going to go my way. Does that make sense? And I have to remind myself of this sometimes. I may not graduate on time for reasons that are beyond my control because admin sometimes sucks. Like they don't do a very good job of coordinating and they can make it very difficult, like for a student just to have the classes that they need to finish. And of course that irritates me, because I have plans. I have a job as soon as I graduate. So my initial response is irritation. Why? Because I'm attached to what? The idea of working at this place. The idea of, I was attached to the idea of being a senior intern. Good intentions, right? Like I want to do it. I'm excited, but I was attached to it enough that it could create suffering. And it did for a while until, I'm doing my practice. And I'm like, I don't feel great. Why is that? Well, I can just follow the trail to the thought. Because it did have a thought behind it. And if it doesn't have a thought behind it, because you're one of those people who just, engage in internal dialogue that much, look at the habit. There's a habit behind it. There's an unconscious pattern behind it. So there is a way of looking at this, Ida, that we don't have to try to figure anything out. We don't have to try to elongate our own physical existence. Principally, the more that we relax our mind, the more that we allow energy to flow smoothly. And of course, the cognitive process is usually what is interfering with that smoothness in the first place. The momentum of habit, the momentum of attachment, the momentum of unresolved emotions and unresolved traumas. And I'm using the term unresolved very loosely. So what I'm recommending is to do the practice and stick to the practice, go back to the practice, allow it to accumulate momentum, and then you can start to fill your bubble of perception with joy. I like to fill my bubble of perception with seeing, that feeling of timelessness, the feeling of quality in the moment. Because I know if I'm feeling that, I'm nurturing my spirit. I'm nurturing my Shen and my Qi. And I know that eventually the physical will follow suit. There may be some action steps behind that, but
Quality is like a mantra for me now. I don't even say the words or think of the mantra. If I find myself distracted by data instead of deliberate data, I will say quality. Was like just let me focus on the quality. Otherwise, I get overwhelmed with just do stuff, and then I don't really get overwhelmed, but I feel the pull towards overwhelm. And then I just say quality. Whatever I'm doing, where's the quality in what I'm doing right now? And then that brings me back.
if that were the case for me, which it is, and let's just be clear. Whoa, I sounded like Bernie Sanders. Let's be clear. Let's be clear. We could be operating on two different definitions of the word quality. We could be. When I say the word quality, I could actually be describing a different feeling, a different experience than Donna is. And that doesn't matter one iota. Because it sounds to me that whatever the fuck Donna's talking about when she uses the word quality, that's what she wants. That's what she wants in her bubble of perception. And my recommendation would be to fill it. Do the practice. The more you do the practice, the more the quality, you know how to reveal the quality. It's always there. We just have to meet it. And what happens when you create a strong bubble of perception? Okay, I can explain it this way. Don Juan would talk about two different things. It's the same concept, but accessibility. He would point out that Carlos made himself way too accessible to human beings. He would complain, he would try to justify himself, he would meet somebody and tell them everything about him, just making myself. And there's nothing wrong with making yourself vulnerable or available, but he was out of balance. He was doing it too much. It was a habit. He would go to it in times of emergency. He would just immediately resort to pettiness, anger, frustration. These were his patterns. These were his habits. They had become a part of his constitution to the point where he couldn't see them. Somebody else would have to point it out. But Don Juan would point out that you are making yourself too accessible to the forces of the world, but you are not making yourself accessible to spirit, because you can't do both. It's a slider to degrees. You're trying to find yourself happy in the middle. But if you're so far in availability to the world, it's going to be very difficult. And this is just a way of talking about things again. It's just we're putting things in groups so that we can say, oh, I get that idea. The idea is we're filling our bubble of perception no matter what. What are we filling it with? Is it purposeful? Is it intentional? Are we making ourselves available to solutions? Are we making ourselves available to creativity? Are we making ourselves available to quality? Are we making ourselves available to personal power? Because if you're in repetitive, habitual responses and thought patterns, you are not available. If your bubble of perception has collapsed on itself and now you're angry and you're frustrated and you're acting like an animal, spirit is less available. I'm not going to say not available, because that's pretty absolute, but it's not that available. Like you're making it less available. And so, of course, this practice is mirrored around what I want. And it sounds like it's a lot of what you want too, because that's why you're here. You want to make yourselves available to spirit, to the forces of the universe that are a little bit more rarefied, that you have to feel to experience. Can't really be talked to. We try to talk about it, but you have to feel it to understand it. Well, understand is a terrible word. You have to feel it to truly experience it. Talking about it will not help you experience it necessarily. Talking about it can give you guidelines on how to get there, which is what the 4 directions practice is all about. It's just a guideline on how to get there. It's functional grouping so that you can remember, so that you can do it, so that we're not just talking shit about the bubble of perception. We're legitimately establishing it, connecting with it, engaging it, moving with it, and that will end up looking very differently for everybody. For me, it looks like a doctor of acupuncture doing research and having a 500 square foot stone house with windows that are just carved into the building. And there's a 150 square foot separate building that I use as my treatment room with a sizable garden in the back for me to grow herbs for the community so that I can do medicine for the community for next to nothing. I like sourdough bread. Donna, you need a treatment and you know how to make sourdough bread, so let's just do a swap. I'll throw some needles in your body to make you feel better and give you some herbs from the garden, and you give me sourdough bread. Why the hell not? I'm cool with that. But I'm just painting the picture of my desire, what my practice is taking me toward. And that is conscious creation. That is the law of attraction. The more that I align myself to what I want, the more I fill it with emotion and how I want to feel, you will hear everything that Abraham Hicks has ever said in all of this if you really look at it. Because we're talking about the same thing. I'm just not trying to make $1 million off of it. No offense. There's lots of things you can do with money. Money's not evil. Yeah. But it's more true to my nature. I am really attracted to the quiet master. That person that you look at and you had no idea. You had no idea that they were this good at something. You had no idea that they had all of this momentum and power and capability. So I'll break it down real quick before we go, and then you guys can give me any ideas you have about this. But in terms of Don Juan, there's 3 fundamental types of training that I engage in. There could be more, but I don't know. I'm just not as interested in those things. So the 3 things that I offer is Sage's training. That's all of this. That's everything that we're doing right now. And the sage is very connected, very aware, moves with their environment. It's everything we've been talking about. It's just a word, a label to organize how I can deliver training to another person if they're interested, if it would benefit them, if they've asked the right questions for me to even talk about it. But then there's the seer. You have the seer and the sage. They're doing 2 slightly different things. They're very interrelated. You could break it down to the same fundamental constituency, but I would say that Donna is very interested in seeing because she's talking about it in the same way. It's the same thing. We're just using slightly different words. She might use the word love. I'm okay with that. I might not. But ultimately, the seer feels the quality of the universe around them, the feeling of the quality of the universe inside of them, even when they're looking at something or feeling something or experiencing something that is less than desirable. That's the ticket. And then there's the hunter. The hunter stalks themselves, and they stalk personal power. And the only way that you can stalk personal power is to pay attention to your own acts of intention and will. And of course, you have to stalk where you're leaking power, where you're injuring your own spirit. And do you try to figure it out? No. Do you try to correct the thing that you think you're doing wrong? No. You focus on your bubble of perception and you fill it. You fill it with quality. You fill it with fun. You fill it with camaraderie. Who the hell knows? What do you want to fill it with? You want to fill it with community support because maybe your community needs that. You make yourself accessible to the wider aperture of the universe, inside and outside. But that practice, the hunter is not, it cannot be a starting point. It just can't. Because if you're leaking power, and it would cause the common mind to just launch into acts of leaking power. Because it does involve looking at yourself, learning, growing, evolving. Where am I leaking power? Do I feel personal power right now? The only way you can feel your personal power is to pay attention to it. That feeling is very strongly centered in the dantian, the lower dantian, just below the navel. About halfway into your whole body, you can feel that. But it doesn't just exist there. It connects to other parts of your body. And I think personal power is very important. I entered a very difficult program just for the fact that it's an act of impeccable intent and I can build personal power. But not if I start whining and complaining and trying to get done and focusing on, oh, I just can't wait to get done with this and get licensed and be, no, now wait a second. Are you doing this as an impeccable act of intent? Or are you doing this because you're attached to something? Now that's different. So I have to check myself constantly. I have to check my emotions constantly. Where am I emotionally? That's a different practice. And that's all my practices. That's pretty much it. I have an emotional practice. I have a mind practice. I have a movement practice. You guys know all of that stuff. And I hunt power. Like I'm hunting my own intention and will. If I'm doing my practice, I remind myself, you're doing it. You have your directions set. Your posture is where you want it to be. Your structural integrity. You're doing your damn thing. Remind yourself of that. Because everybody in this room, hey Lisa, everybody in this room has been practicing for years. That's fucking awesome. Like that's really great. When's the last time you focused on that fact? When's the last time you allowed yourself to feel good about the shit you've done? That's a part of personal power growth. Of course, if we start to think about it rather than feel it, now we might start to get into ego land. That's weird. We don't want to be there. But I want to focus on the feeling, make myself available to the feeling of personal power. And that's actually conscious creation times 10. All that makes sense? Ida, is that helpful to the situation?
Yes, I often think that what you do in private over time is seen in public as some kind of um, miraculous thing, but you've put in all the hours in private. It's a bit like art or working out or something like that. When you were saying that feeling when your desire is to be a doctor in Chinese medicine, when you have to go through all the procedure that you have to go through to get there. But those days of the procedure, I hate this word, or the journey, the journey. Those days of the procedure are the journey, and they're what you're doing mostly in private to achieve something that is seen years down the line as sometimes people say it's an overnight success when a band just hits the number one spot and they're an overnight success, but they had maybe 10 years in a damp basement or a garage somewhere, and playing in clubs where maybe 3 people turned up. And
Yeah.
that's not an overnight success. That's years and years of practice. And it's the same with us with this practice.
Right.
People sometimes look at me when I come out with statements that are so normal to me now. And I don't talk about this practice, but it kind of can't help but show itself in how you proceed in your life. But I do have to remind myself that these days of the journey are just as important as the end game. The days of the journey are the present, and this is what I'm doing right now when I'm doing weights or squats or something. I'm thinking, this is what I do, and I like the result of what I'm doing. So this part of it is just as important as I don't even think about the end result now. I just think about what the person I'd like to be does these things, and I do these things. And I think that's personal power.
Yeah. I would stress that this practice is very intensive in focusing on the feeling of something. So there's times, Ida, where I have to talk to myself exactly the way you just said. I have to use almost verbatim those words at times, but then my words are actually just going to say, establish your bubble of perception and feel it. Do you feel the Andy Dufresne principle? And the way that Don Juan would term it, I call it the Andy Dufresne principle. That's a very earnest thing. Like that's very unique to me. But Don Juan would call it the warrior spirit. The mood of a warrior is no, not reckless, controlled abandon. And that seems like a contradiction, but of course, even without using those words, Don Juan is describing when you harmonize yin and yang, you get a new third thing. When you are harmonizing, I should say, because there's no end product. When you're harmonizing, you get a new third thing. So now oftentimes, Ida, I just remind myself, do you feel it? No? Go back to your practice and feel it. Everything else will take care of itself. Everything else, literally everything under the sun, under the stars, and the entire universe will take care of itself as long as I am feeling the warrior's mood. It looks a lot like Just Do Energy. It looks a lot like, I've chosen to go to school. Now I'm just going to do it. Not going to worry about it. Not gonna, bother myself about it. I'm just gonna do it because I've chosen to do it. And now that's the abandon.
And sometimes
Control.
I think of
Mhm.
the alternative, Ernest, of
What's that?
not doing it.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes I think of the alternative of not,
Mm-hmm.
when I'm really finding it tough, I think the alternative and the way I'll feel if I don't carry through what I have said that I'll do, not without hurting myself physically or mentally, but to have the strength of will to carry it through. And on days when it's really tough, sometimes I do, if I've somewhere in my mind says you don't have to do this today, you could take a day off, then I go to my what's the best solution here. I'm going to do it, but I might cut my routine in half and do that, and at least I can go to bed tonight and tick that off my it's done. If I really don't feel like doing the whole thing, well then I'll do half, and I'll only do that occasionally when time pressures or something, there's too many things in my diary to look at. I still want to keep up the very minimum on the hard days, and that's how I kind of get over that. There's no leaking power in that, because at least I've showed up and I've done something
Mm-hmm.
towards my desire.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where
Yeah.
I'm at.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's times where I'm at that too, and then there's also times where it's just go back. Where's your mood? Where's the mood of the warrior? If it doesn't exist, I have no business focusing on personal power. I'm probably just hustling myself at that point, actually. But it is a really tricky thing to stop trying to find solutions to, that we called them destroyers for a reason. It's a pretty hefty word to use. All right. Any other questions? Does that all make sense? Okay. See you, Lisa. Thanks for hanging out. All right, cool. Well, I'll be back next week, and my website, I will launch that pretty soon. Launch it. I'll make it available.